We would like to acknowledge the indigenous lands and the cultures of New York. We honor the land as the Creator intended, and that we commit to keep it clean and support efforts to make it safe for all. We can show honor to the native keepers of the land by recognizing the value of their cultures and by learning the truth of their history and how it provided the foundation for this country as we experience it today. It is always vital for us to show acknowledgement. I can't tell you how important it is to one's being and how they navigate the world to be encouraged by the acknowledgement of their being and their existence. So we should continue to do so at all passages and at our nearest conveniences. So I want to keep that spirit of acknowledgement in introducing our guest speaker for today, but I want our audience to prepare, if you're able to, within your control panel, I want you to see that reaction tab and get it ready, just an emoji of welcome or acknowledgement. If you hear anything within this bio that you think is an amazing feat, a grand accomplishment, something that you might be encouraged by or aspire to do or see more around you, just give an emoji in reaction to it, because there should be praise given to jobs well done, especially when it has to do with education and the human condition around the world. So I'll get right into this bio for our guest speaker and click on something if you hear something that's amazing or that you like. We are featuring today Yashica Dutt. She is an internationally acclaimed Dalit, we'll get into that later, journalist and an award-winning author, while being among the most recognized global feminist voices on Caste. Dutt just completed a 16-city US tour, speaking at 25 events in over 12 weeks for her book, Coming Out as Dalit, which was released worldwide in February this year. Dutt's work has been published in the New York Times, Foreign Policy, and The Atlantic, and she has been featured on the BBC channel, The Guardian, PBS Newshour, and at the Lincoln Center. Her writing has been part of PEN America's India at 75, anthology that featured prominent Indian writers looking back on India's history in its 75th year of independence, and a collection titled Our Freedoms, Essays and Stories from India's Best Writers. Coming Out as Dalit, which was published in the South Asian subcontinent in 2019, quickly became a bestseller and is currently part of the curriculum in over 50 colleges and universities worldwide, including Harvard University, UC Berkeley, and UC Davis. So we're going to share some links and some things so you can continue to support the success of this memoir. Coming Out as Dalit is among the first books written by a Dalit author in English to win the historic Anti-Caste bill in the city of Seattle, and her writing has been instrumental in shaping the text of the first in-nation law. The highly anticipated revised and updated version of Coming Out as Dalit has been published by Beacon Press this year and has been called An Elucidating History of Dalit Discrimination and Activism by Kirkus Review. This new edition focuses on the ongoing struggle for caste rights in the US and helps unpack its crucial and urgent history, especially in the light of the recent historic veto of California's caste discrimination bill. Dutt is currently working on her second book on caste in the United States, also commissioned by Beacon Press. She graduated from Columbia Journalism School and lives in Brooklyn, New York City. Please give a warm Learning Café welcome to our featured guest and speaker, Yashica Dutt.
Hi everyone. Elijah, that was a great welcome. Thank you so much. Extremely generous. And hi everybody, to everyone who is here. I just want to say a big shout out to everybody for being here this afternoon. This is a very busy season. Elections are exactly 2 months away, and you have still made time to join us to learn about caste, a subject that for some reason we haven't heard much about during this election season. In fact, at all last year. So I applaud each and every one of you and your commitment to be here, and a big round of applause to you and Elijah and the Learning Café for organizing this. So thank you so much for having me here today.
You are most welcome. Thank you so much again. As we said before, this isn't your first time making your rounds with the Learning Café. You got a lot of good feedback coming from the first feature and the amount of audience members that just wanted to learn more or get a little bit more in depth. So I know that you have some readings from your new edition that you have prepared for us, and then we have some questions that we have prepared for you. Anyone who is here and under the sound of my voice, please feel free to enter any of your questions that you might have for our guest and featured speaker. Down in your control panel, you should see a section that has Q&A, and we'll make sure we'll try our best to get the questions to Yashica with the limited time that we have with her.
Elijah, thank you so much. So as you mentioned, coming out as Dalit, this is the new cover of the book. I hope you can see it despite my blurred background. Yeah, here it is. It was published in India in 2019, and I struggled for a long time to get this book to the United States, which should tell you something about the lack of willingness within this country, especially among the South Asian, Indian American diaspora, to talk about caste, because there was absolutely no interest to talk about the subject that is so hugely important in India, within the Indian diaspora, across the world. And this book, which has, been applauded, appreciated, recognized even by the highest Indian literary institutions. It took me a very long time for this book to come to the US, and I'm so glad it finally did, because it was published in February this year. And while the bulk of the book is the same, because I just brought it to a new audience, I have added a couple of extra chapters. So if there are some folks who attended my last session, I think in August 2022, and I hear again, first of all, thank you. And secondly, there are some new chapters that I have added in the book that specifically address the subject of caste as it appears in the United States, not in India, not in the South Asian subcontinent, not in a place far beyond, but here right among us. And these two chapters highlight the role of the Indian American minority, but also the complicitness of the entire white supremacist culture in the United States that allowed Indians and Indian Americans to continue without ever having to mention caste. So what I'm reading for you today is a short passage, and I promise to keep it short, from this chapter called Silicon Valley, Model Minority, and the Myth of Castelessness. The notorious case of Bhagat Singh Thind, an Indian immigrant who in 1923 argued to be considered white since he was a high caste Aryan full of Indian blood. This is a remarkable insight into the period's eugenics-flavored upper caste ideology, by which several upper caste Indians considered themselves genetically superior to Dalits and Adivasis, and instead more aligned with white Caucasians. As Thind lost the case, ultimately leading to scores of Indians having their citizenship neutralized by 1926, equating upper casteness to whiteness became a losing strategy. However, by 1960s, around the second big wave of Indian upper caste immigration, identifying as not Black was quickly becoming a go-to for Indian Americans. There was a common thread of understanding that emerged. The path to social and financial security was to avoid the taint of Blackness. While professional Indians no longer did so through recourse to whiteness, as had earlier elite migrants, they now leveraged class, nationality, and most importantly, educational achievement to fashion themselves as members of a model minority. Writes Ajanta Subramaniam, our former Harvard professor and currently employed at CUNY, in her book, The Caste of Merit. Regardless, Indian Americans who moved to the US over the last century were treated with racism, with many of them still considered Black, regardless of their effortful delineations. During her interviews with several Indian Institute of Technology graduates from the 1960s, Ajanta Subramaniam discovered the tactics which several immigrant Indians employed to distinguish themselves as not Black. especially in the South, which was still in its Jim Crow era. Men started wearing a turban, whether or not they wore one back home in India, while women were encouraged to wear a sari to identify themselves as distinctly Indian. I got the impression that the South was embarrassed to be mistreating foreign visitors. One of the interviewees told Ajanta Subramaniam they had no problem discriminating against the American Black people, but they went to lengths to ensure that we were fine, he said. This disposition, although prevalent in the upper caste Indian immigrant professions of the time, more or less ignored the efforts of the Black civil rights movement that, after decades of exclusion, made Indian immigrants' re-entry in the US possible with the changes in the 1965 US immigration laws. Immigrants from India, armed with degrees, arrived after the height of the civil rights movement and benefited from a struggle that they had not participated or even witnessed. They made their way not only to cities, but to suburbs, and broadly speaking, were accepted more easily than other non-white groups have been. Reads an Atlantic piece titled The Truth Behind Indian American Exceptionalism. Mindsets towards those who were lower than them on the hierarchy of caste among upper caste Indian Americans easily transferred to those who they saw now as being lower than us on the hierarchy of race. By not treating Indian foreigners with the same disdain and disgust they did Black folks who had helped build their country, white Southerners, among others, inscripted a racial hierarchy where Indians, who were neither the highest but not the lowest either, found themselves squarely in the middle. This new racial marker perfectly aligned with the self-ordained myths of upper caste Indian graduates, who, according to Professor Ajanta Subramaniam, already equated their middle class identity with the constructed idea of upper caste merit, and further propelled this notion, leading them to define themselves as different, if not better, than Black Americans. This is an excerpt from the chapter that I just mentioned that, as you heard, explicitly talked about the efforts of early Indian American immigrants, specifically those who moved here in the second big wave of Indian immigration, people whose children are now the second generation of Indian Americans, like Mindy Kaling, like Hassan Minhaj, all these people who are Indian American in entertainment who are very visible, their parents, Aziz Ansari, their parents moved to the US post 1965 big wave of immigration. And as this chapter documents, and there has been research that has been done extensively everywhere, that there were great efforts within the Indian American minority communities and the diaspora to make sure that they were not mistaken to be Black Americans, which is why, when I talked earlier about caste has not been talked about in this election cycle, that feels off, that feels something that is a willful ignorant lack of attention, because caste has a huge history of being tied into the Indian American diaspora. And as we all know that our presidential hopeful Democratic candidate, Kamala Harris, comes from not only an Indian, but an Indian Black family. And there is so much subtext, there is so much background there that we need to unpack and discuss, especially as VP Harris is making herself known to the American public, that we need to discuss. And I'm truly hoping that after this session today, you will go back with some more questions than answers to investigate how does caste operate in between our backgrounds, in our communities, in our localities.
Yashica, thank you so much for reading that excerpt, pardon me, of your book and the more chapters that draw a lot of parallels. I think you started off in a very, 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 very very important way, in an impactful way, because you're doing something where, okay, this is not, like you said, just off in a far off place. This is immediate. This is among you and in your midst. How are you assessing your awareness of these things? So just based off of what you're saying, would you be able to speak on whether or not there is any progress or the mentality of forming what you call model minority mentality or mindset? Do you see, because you spoke on early immigration periods, but you also spoke on a modern status of our current presidential candidate and vice president. So it's kind of like a comparison between then and now. A lot of us who hear this may say, oh, that this is progression. What would you say to the model minority mentality? Has there been a change and a desire to kind of hold this mentality or use it as a way to maneuver socially through the United States? Social identity and issues of racism and prejudice.
That's such a great question, Elijah. And, I've known you for a long time. You always come with the incredible questions. So thank you for that. And I think this is really important because VP Harris, her emergence as a candidate for the highest office in the nation, and some might argue even the entire, the world, shows progress. She has a Black and an Indian background. Does that mean South Asians, Indian Americans in particular, do not have a latent idea of anti-Blackness? Does that mean, have they stopped efforts to make themselves look not Black? Have they stopped um, considering Black folks lower than themselves in the hierarchy that exists in this white supremacist culture? There could be several answers to this, but all the research that I have done, that many other academics have done, will point to saying no. And the reason for that is because South Asian Americans have deep-seated ideas of anti-Blackness that come from obviously having lived in the US, but that come from caste. The idea that we have an internal radar for hierarchy. Indian people in the South Asian subcontinent, Indian Americans, Pakistanis, people who come from Pakistan, people who come from Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bangladesh. These South Asian countries, because they come from one region, we don't need to be told that there is a hierarchy that exists. I can't speak for other nations, but some countries probably don't have the same exact idea of hierarchy that South Asia does, because there is such a codified and exact system of discrimination based on one's caste. We grow up with the caste system. We know from very early childhood who's dominant caste and who's lower caste. Even if we don't know what our caste is, because some people try to pretend that they're post caste, they try to shield their children from the harsh realities of what caste system is, the way they treat lower caste people, whether they are working class people, whether they're people who work in their homes, in their factories, who do dehumanizing jobs of manual scavenging, of cleaning dead animals, and many other dehumanizing systems of work that still exist in India. Indians in particular, and I can speak for that because I'm from there, understand what it means to have a system of hierarchy in place. And that ultimately, when it collides with global anti-Black racism and dark skin racism that exists in our own country, it's not very difficult for Indians to immediately understand Black people are lower than us on the scale of hierarchy, and we are above. We are not higher than white folks. We are somewhere in the middle, which is what I talked about in the excerpt. And what that means is that there is an inherent sense of distrust. There is an inherent sense of, one might call, hatred towards people who are essentially, like I mentioned, who built this country, who have been systemically disenfranchised, systemically subjugated and mistreated. But instead of fostering a sense of solidarity, there is a sense of, how do we make ourselves separate? Oh, this is their problem. I don't want to get involved in this white versus black supremacist culture. But the truth is, any minorities that come to this country find themselves on a scale of hierarchy because this is a white supremacist system. It makes sure that everyone who comes who is not white is somewhere on the ladder below them. And I think that one of the things that the Indian communities here fail to understand, that it makes so much more sense for us to build solidarity with other oppressed minorities than to consider ourselves as superior. However, to me, that also feels very much in line with our caste culture, because we have a culture of caste in our country and in a diaspora, that they would not do so. Because, and let me tell you this fact, in 1965, the wave of immigration that I spoke about, people who migrated to the US, 90% or over happened to be from a dominant caste background. So lower caste people like myself were not even allowed to migrate to the US, because the US criteria of migration was that they had to be excelling in fields of science and technology. And science and technology fields back in India are inherently tied to upper casteness, because Dalit people like myself and my family weren't even allowed to touch books till not many generations ago. So we were systemically kept away from being educated, and these fields are populated by dominant caste people. So when high caste people who already have a sense of entitlement, who already have a sense that we are higher in the hierarchy of our own version of caste, come into this country, they're not going to consider themselves in solidarity with people who are considered lower, aka Black folks. They're going to think of themselves as higher. So this is me trying to explain how the hierarchical idea of caste is very neatly superimposed on the hierarchical idea of race. And the reason VP Harris's existence, so to speak, and her ascendance into this national stage of prominence is not a measure of progress, is because she is one example that exists. And it's a beautiful example, but I think we don't know enough about the challenges that Mrs. Harris, Shamla Gopalan, her mother, dealt with while raising two mixed Black Indian girls. There is a lot of research, and I've been doing a lot of research because I've been working on a series of articles about Shamla Gopalan and how she came to the country. Well, first thing that we need to understand is Shamla Gopalan and her family come from the elites of Indian caste system. They are Brahmins. Her father was a diplomat who in 1950s India, mind you, this country is like 3 years independent. It has seen staggering levels of colonialism, of hunger, of poverty. People are dying from famines every year. And in that state, certain families are elite enough that they have immense amount of wealth, immense amount of educational privilege. And Shamla Gopalan's father was a diplomat who traveled to many African countries even, and traveled around the world and sent his kids, not one kid, because Mrs. Gopalan has talked about having many brothers and sisters who moved abroad to study. So having the finances in a country where my family at that time was struggling to get an education while their kids were, coming abroad to study. So just drawing a parallel, we need to be very clear that VP Harris comes from an extremely privileged background back in India. However, what's remarkable is Shamla Gopalan fell in love with a Black Jamaican academic research student, and then they got married. And this is often talked about if you look into the history, that they were supposed to she was supposed to go back home and have an arranged marriage, but then she went against her parents' wishes and then married this Black man. We don't know enough about what happened then, because from our experience, marrying a Black man, even today, invites so much hate on any South Asian people, especially if you're a woman marrying a Black man in a heteronormative, heterosexual relationship. you can, and I encourage our viewers to look up, there are several YouTube accounts, there are several Instagram accounts where girls who are South Asian have married their Black partners, have given birth to mixed race babies, and you look at the hate that they receive from South Asians today in 2024. There have been many Black women who have been married into South Asian families, who've been married to who've been married to Desi men, to South Asian men, and the hate that they receive. You can go and read the comments, and that's today. So, are we to assume that in 1958 or 1960, when this prestigious elite Brahmin family that is so coded in their caste culture, when the daughter decides to defy the rule of arranged marriage and marry a Black person and have two mixed girls, what is that going to lead to? I think that it's not speculation. This is an important fact that needs to be talked about because it shapes the attitudes of South Asian communities towards Black folks. And that's the tension that lies in the US today. I've seen VP Harris has energized people across the spectrum. I'm part of many South Asian groups where they are canvassing for her. They're going out on the streets using their off days on Labor Days. There was a huge wave of Labor Day. There was a huge wave of people who were going door to door to canvass for VP Harris. But they claim her as a South Asian woman. They rarely talk about the fact that she's Black. And within media, she's mostly claimed as a South Asian Black woman. So I think that difference is very telling. And in fact, I've heard, and since this is a closed door conversation, permission to speak candidly, I've heard many South Asian folks saying, why do they never mention she's South Asian? Why is her Black identity so prominent, whereas South Asian identity not? The tension will only become to grow further. VP Harris, in her acceptance speech at the DNC in Chicago a couple of weeks ago, talked about how she grew up with a Black family, how she grew up in a Black middle-class neighborhood. She talks about the aunties who raised her, the uncles that she learned to play chess with. And that's a beautiful story. But one has to wonder, why did Shamla Gopalan, who is South Asian, not live in a South Asian community, but instead chose to live in a Black middle-class neighborhood? Why would her parents, who are arguably extremely wealthy, allow her to do that? Does that not indicate a backlash or a rift for not just marrying a Black man, but divorcing him? Divorce in India is still considered a massive taboo. And I can speak that because I come from a family of domestic violence. And despite my mother having experienced the worst in her life when it comes to domestic violence, when it comes to spousal abuse, intimate partner violence, she still not has divorced my father, because that's the stigma that divorce carries in India. So Shamla Gopalan not only married him, but divorced him. One has to wonder what the backlash was. And in that backlash lies the tension, lies the answers of the relationship between Black and South Asian communities right now. I think we can gloss over, we can say we're all good, we are one, we are looking forward to our one candidate who presents the best of all of us. But the truth is, there is a lot that is not being talked about. And one last point I will make in response to this question: have we moved forward? When Usha Vance, who is the spouse, who is the partner, the wife of JD Vance, who is the Trump VP nominee, when JD Vance was picked and debuted on the nation stage as a potential VP candidate, and her vice president, his wife, also came into the spotlight, and it was found out that she's Indian origin. Her parents moved here again in the 1965 wave. So, like, just to make these connections, her parents moved here. She was a registered Democrat until the last election, is now a Republican supporting, wife of a Republican VP nominee. And when all those questions started coming up, the response, a major response from a huge section of the Indian American community was, it's because we are a model minority. This is the right type of brown person. people, especially who lean conservative, said this is the type of, there is a reason Indians have done so well. It's because they don't need, and you can look up, this was an article that was published in Wall Street Journal where people talked, where the author talked about Indians have not relied on help from the government. They have pulled themselves up from their bootstraps. They have not needed to rely on any handouts. And mind you, this is the same language that dominant caste, upper caste Indians used against us. Where is this inherent understanding to kick Black people down coming from? It's because they have learned it by doing it to us in India for decades and decades. They say that to us. Why are dominant caste people better? Because they don't need handouts. They don't need to be, they don't need any kind of assistance. They don't need affirmative actions. Therefore, they are better. Not understanding that they have effectively colonized every resource in the entire subcontinent while actively forcing Dalit people into servitude, into bonded labor, into caste labor from which they have no way to get out from. And after generations and generations of acquiring that wealth, whether it is material wealth, whether it is cultural wealth, whether it is educational wealth, they talk about, oh, we don't need a handout because see how talented we are inherently. And then they can use the same argument, bring it against Black people, bring it against Latinx folks, bring it against Native American people. And this is what's happening right now. And unfortunately, the way we have seen American media react in the past couple of months, especially, whether it comes to silencing voices who are pro-Palestine, whether it comes to silencing voices who are talking about castes, we have not seen that coverage yet.
Is truly just riveting amounts of information that you touch on. It's a quote from Malcolm X: "Your history is best at assisting and awarding your research," and you are very well informed and very diligent with your research. Intersectionality is the confusing piece amongst all of this, the more nebulous thing that we can't put like a solid definition or comprehension to, or most of us may faint comprehension of what intersectionality is, but you've talked about that in great depth, and just seeing how truly complicated all these factors in. And this is why we love having you on Learning Cafe, because you give us bombshells. You gave us a bombshell in the last Learning Cafe when you told us, hey, Learning Cafe community and Elijah, this caste system that you've learned about, probably incorrectly in your Western education, K through 12, this is something that wasn't introduced to India through colonization. It was there before. So I guess I would ask a follow-up question on, and you can draw from your research and from your personal experience, this kind of polarization between defining and associating between Blackness and whiteness. What were these concepts, if any, in India prior to colonization and prior to introduction or influence from places like Britain? Because you told us, hey, this caste system was already in place. We already have an oppressive kind of system and hierarchy. Were there any concepts of a Blackness and a whiteness, and was there any kind of racial significance prior to any introduction to colonial powers?
That's a really interesting question, because I think the hierarchy that India has always had is based on the birth of one in a certain family. It is less based on skin color, and I'm going to go into that in a minute, but hold that thought. It is based less in skin color and more in what family that you're born in. The family of your caste, the caste of your family is what is most important, even more than one's skin color. There are in the southern part of the country, and I'm sure many of our listeners and people who are part of the community will know that there are so many dark-skinned South Asians that exist. There are so many dark-skinned Sri Lankans who are darker than many Black folks in the US even. There are many people who are in southern part of the country, people in my family who are absolutely dark, like dark, 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 like the color of the mustache and the color of the skin is the same. And that part of our reality has always existed. And if truth be told, it was that part of our population as South Asians that was exploited by the British, the concept of colorism was perpetuated, if not introduced, by the colonial powers. Because the whole idea of a white man's burden, we know Kipling, we know the idea that, white folks are better than any other people across the world. The privilege and supremacy of whiteness came to us through colonial influences. But that does not mean that we did not already have our own system of supremacy in place in India, which was less limited or less contingent on color and absolutely rooted in what one's caste was. Now, let me give you an example. In the southern part of India, where I talked about where there are many dark-skinned Indians, many of them belong to Brahmin castes. Many of them belong to absolutely upper castes. Coming back to VP Harris for a moment, because she is, the most talked about person right now across in our country. If you look at her family, there are so many dark-skinned folks. And they've talked about it, and it is absolutely believable that because of the color of their skin, they possibly, and the accent that they carried, they possibly faced a lot of discrimination even in this country. So dark skin discrimination has always existed in the US, obviously, even against dark skinned Indians, but that does not negate the caste and the cultural and the wealth privilege that they also bring with them. Because for us, in our worldview, color is but one factor, it's one location of discrimination. But outside of that, there are so many others. You see me, I look light skinned to you now. It's because unfortunately, the Indian summer really gives me my color back, and I haven't been back home in so long. But despite that, my family has, like I said, dark skinned folks, and light skinned folks like myself and my mother. And we come from the lowest of the low manual scavenging communities. We come from, many of you might have seen Ava DuVernay's excellent film, Origin, where she describes the plight of Dalit people, where she talks about manual scavenging, where people are forced to clean human excrement with their bare hands. That's my community. That's my family. That's the background that I come from. And when it comes to the dehumanization and the subjugation that comes from that, the color of one's skin has very little to do with how we are considered dirty, how we're considered disgusting, how we're considered not worthy of being humans. That does not define who we are. What defines is a caste status. However, having said that, let's complicate that a little bit because I know this audience is up to it. Dark skin has also been in the northern part of the country where people are light skinned, associated with being lower caste. So there's a huge divide in culture in India between the north and the south. The north is a specific kind of culture, south is a specific kind of culture. In the north, if you're dark skinned, you are considered lower caste. And there is a huge effort because of colonialization, because of earlier invasions, from Persia, from Greece. Many other invaders have come to the Indian subcontinent and have mixed with Indian people. There is an obsession with being light-skinned. So in India, there is no other country, I think, outside of few African countries, has more obsession with bleaching their skin than Indian people do. It is something that we are told to do because, especially, think about being lower caste. You're lower caste, you're dark skinned. One way that you can transcend your caste is by appearing light skinned. So what a lot of Dalit girls in particular, because it's the burden of skin color falls mostly on women. It's women who are supposed to be light skinned. Men can be dark, and that's still acceptable. But women have to bear the burden of being fair and lovely, which is literally the name of a cream that is the best-selling cream in India. It's a face cream that has a bleaching agent that's supposed to make you lighter. And it's a face cream I have used. It's a face cream my mother has used. I was raised to bleach my skin for many, many years because that's the way I would be able to transcend the notion of my lower casteness. So dark skin and obsession with skin color is very much a part of our culture, and it does relate back to caste, but it also relates to colonialism. So it's slightly, if bear with me, if you will, there is a more nuanced conversation to be had about colorism. But that doesn't mean that when that vector falls onto Black people, and when you see folks who are dark skinned, they are not blanketly treated horribly by many South Asian people. We know instances of abhorrent anti-Blackness against none other than African students. Nigeria and India have a long-standing relationship, especially of, education, in terms of education, in terms of technology. Many exchange students who are from wealthier parts of African countries, Sierra Leone and Nigeria, and many other Ethiopia, when they come to India to study in Indian universities, they face the worst kind of anti-Black racism and colorism from Indians who might be even darker than them sometimes. And that's the messed up part of this equation, that anti-Blackness has taken such an enormous root in the global subconscious of the entire world. And at the same time, it's exacerbated by our own ideas of caste and colorism, that there have been horrifying instances of Black students, African students being treated in the worst possible way when they travel across India.
I appreciate you, Yashica. This is a nuance is the thing that we have to focus on, and that's what leads us learning many new things. I'm learning new things from each sentence that you eat, that you continue to speak. I want to ask you this, because it would seem to assume you talk about the global consciousness and its adaptation or its indoctrination of whiteness, its concept of whiteness, these kinds of things now, and in association with the caste system. Now, we would assume that if you were in an upper caste and you were a Brahmin family, but you were an immigrant to the United States, we would assume that those families belonging to those upper class associations would naturally take on tenets of whatever racial or prejudice socialization was going in the US that could help them better maneuver or enjoy any avenue or iota of privilege. We assume that that's the given. The more difficult and nuanced question I would like to ask is, were there members of the Dalit community, if and when having any opportunity to immigrate to the US, were they more likely to draw solidarity with groups of African Americans and other marginalized groups in the US? Or did you see, from your research and personal experience, did you see the opposite of that, where, okay, this is a new chance to kind of escape the caste designation, and I can reassert myself in a new hierarchy here, where I take on those tenets and disassociations and remove myself further from any solidarity with an undesired group in the United States?
That's such a great question. I love the layers that you bring in. I love the layers that we're going into this conversation. It's so rich. And that's why I keep coming back here, because, we build on so much here, and it's giving me new ideas. So I think before I answer your question, let me just say, as South Asians, as South Asian Americans, Indian Americans in particular, we punch way above our population weight. If you think about the population size of South Asians, it's less than 2% of the entire population of the United States. Within that 2% of the population of the United States, 2% are now Dalits. So over 98% are maybe dominant caste, Hindus, Muslims, Christians. Many of them can also be Dalit. Muslims can be Dalit, Christians can be Dalit. But taking everything, 2% of that 2% is a Dalit population, which is to say a very, very small population. Dalit is a self-defined term for the oppressed lower caste people. So as, formerly untouchable people, we have decided, many of us have decided to call ourselves with this word Dalit, which in Hindi and Marathi translates to somebody who has been oppressed. So this is a title that we claim for ourselves. And Dalit is a common term used for lower caste people. So I've been saying lower caste, I've been saying formerly untouchable. So that also translates to think about that as Dalit. And Dalits are scheduled caste in the Indian constitution. They are considered as a lower caste people. Therefore, they have been given certain affirmative action privileges. And along with Dalits, we also have tribal people, the indigenous Indian people who are called Adivasis or the Indian tribes. They are also extremely and brutally discriminated against. So, out of the Indian population that exists in total in this country, and also it's one of the most rapidly increasing minority populations in the United States, only 2% happen to be Dalits, formerly oppressed, formerly untouchable people, lower caste people, and Adivasis, who are Indian indigenous people. So our brethren, my people, have only started coming to the US in the 2000s. So that is how recent have Dalit people been able to come to the United States, because in 2000s there was yet another wave of immigration that was started by the dot-com boom. Some people might remember that here. It happened in the 90s, where a lot of Indian techies were needed in the United States. And that's when a lot more Indians ended up coming to the US. And with them, some Dalit students were able to come to the US as well. Especially fun fact, I just completed 10 years of having moved to the US yesterday. So I moved here only, thank you, it's been a long journey as an immigrant, so horrifying. So that's for some other day. But, Dalit people have only recently been able to come to this country. And a lot of the people who come here inherently identify with Black people. In fact, not just Dalits who come here, but Dalits who are back home. You don't know this, but we are so in awe of Black culture, but not in an appropriate way. We're not in awe of hip hop. We're not in awe of the way folks dress. We're in awe of the literature that has come from Black communities, Black academics, Black writers, Black thinkers, and the way they have thought about race, the way they have challenged white supremacist cultures, the way they have asserted themselves. So many Dalit people who are, either students, who are even workers, who are professionals, are very inspired by the way the Black movement has been able to assert itself in the United States. And this is something that has been documented extensively. Even working professionals who are not academics, they are very inspired by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. And it's a shame that I haven't spoken about him yet. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, if you have seen Origin, he has been compared to, not accurately, but in some way, maybe the MLK of our times. He is a Dalit leader who was instrumental in getting Dalits equal rights at the time of India's independence. He's the reason we have affirmative action for Dalits. He's the reason why Dalits were considered equal citizens. He's the reason why even Dalit people had the opportunity to have an equal seat at the table. Because if it was left to other dominant caste leaders who were fighting with the British at the time of India's independence, Dalits would be nowhere. So people think, and I think I understand that emotion, I might not agree with it, but a lot of people consider Dr. B.R. Ambedkar as their personal God, because he is the one. Many people say it is because he was, that's why we are. So there is a great sense of reverence towards Dr. B.R. Ambedkar in our Dalit communities. And guess who Dr. B.R. Ambedkar had the best and very respectful associations with? W.E.B. Du Bois. He has always had associations with Black leaders, with Black thinkers. He has quoted them extensively in his texts. So whether we know any Black people or not, like before moving here, I didn't know any Black folks, but I knew of the writing that had been cultivated. And this is, mentioned in Isabel Wilkerson's book Caste. This has been mentioned in the movie. When MLK went to India, he did not meet Ambedkar because Ambedkar I think he wasn't around at that time, or one of the trips Ambedkar was already had passed away, but he did meet Gandhi, and he was very inspired by the Gandhian ideas, whereas Gandhi was bitterly not for the caste movement. Let's just leave it at that. And I remember Dr. King had talked about when he was visited India and he went to a school. This is a story in origin as well. When he went to a school that was run by for Dalit children, and the principal was a Dalit man, was an untouchable man, lower caste man. He said,
Mm,
"Here, meet a fellow untouchable." And Dr. King felt a little bruised by that. He's like, "What do you mean?" And then later he reflected and he said, well, of course, in my country, I am treated like an untouchable person. And the solidarity was immediately and so beautifully and simply created back then. So, what I'm trying to say here is that all of us, me included, we feel such an affinity to this community that many of us haven't even met
mm,
because of the struggles that you all have gone through and shown us the way to do it. We feel a great deal of inspiration. We feel a great deal of reverence because, America is a first world country. What happens in America impacts across the world. And we've seen whether, we've had our own version of Dalit Panthers, Dalit again, formerly untouchable people, inspired by Black Panthers, who were formed in the 1970s.
mm.
Same ideas, same ideals, same call to action, same upliftment of community, and they were also acknowledged by the Black Panthers themselves. We've had a huge history, and I would encourage our listeners here today, people who are attending, to go look into the history of Black and Dalit histories and relationships and how far that connection goes. It goes really, really far, where thinkers from each space have quoted one another, have talked about how we're doing things, we have talked about how they're doing things, and there is a history that remains. But I'm not going to ignore the question that you asked, where you said, do people find it more convenient to just absolve themselves of their caste background and say, this is a time for me to start a new life? I think that automatically comes with having left behind a society that is so obsessed with your caste background. Like for me, for the first time when I moved to the US 10 years ago, I felt free. And not because America, freedom, etc., bald eagle. No, not that. Because I was not being asked about my caste. For the
Mm.
first time, I was free from the question, from the inquiry, from the investigation of my caste. And that did give me an opportunity to rebuild myself, to think about who I was, to think about what I could do, to think about what caste had meant to me my entire life. And I think for many people, that experience is the same. We are in a Stockholm syndrome situation with caste. And when we break free and move to maybe the US, the UK, any other part of the world where caste is not as prominent, we are forced to rethink our relationship with it. And for most people, I can say confidently from the people that I've met, we don't consider ourselves at par with white people. While there is, a tendency to not ruffle the feathers. I just talked about how hard immigration is. We
Mhm.
cannot be, if an immigrant on a visa is arrested, even during a protest, they'll be deported. There are many dangers by being an immigrant. So many people don't feel comfortable, our tweets so many times, at least in 2016, when Trump was in office, immigration officers would be able to pull out your phone and check what tweets you've sent, what Facebook messages you've sent. Were they anti-American? So a lot of people who are new immigrants, especially Dalit people, don't feel comfortable openly discussing how they feel about the
Mm.
hierarchical structures, especially if they work in tech. But I do know for a fact that we feel nothing but an alliance and affinity and solidarity with Black communities. And I think as more Dalit people come to the United States, you will feel that presence even more.
Thank you, because that it sometimes this is a beacon of hope because sometimes you don't know the level of correspondence and how far efforts for the human condition and civil rights actually carry all over the world, and we're often pushed to see history and just sociology of different people across the world as linear and very narrow-minded. So this is a good thing to know. I have to ask you one more thing. It's almost unfair because I know we only got 3 minutes, but I have to ask you this because it made me think of, okay, regional geographical proximity. We've seen during the previous, or actually not even the previous, the current presidential status and certain laws and legislation that were put in place, some of those being dedicated towards the AAPI community. And some of us in
Mm,
our audience, we would like to know, it doesn't seem like the voice of Dalit people, Indian South Asians who experience caste over in the mainland and in America. It doesn't seem like the very important and very dire experience of their cause is ever amplified or kind of mentioned in those series of challenges when we talk about the AAPI community. Could you just speak a little bit towards why it seems like they're not included into that collective, and how those countries and those different groups of people kind of view the Dalit plight?
mm. Such a great question. I think this could have been like a 15-minute question on its own, but I'll try and wrap it up in 2 minutes. So I think the category of being Asian American is complicated because we are forced to limit ourselves. How many countries are AAPI? If you think about it, 20 countries form, at least 20 plus official countries form the AAPI communities. They have differences, not only in languages, not only in cultures, not only in backgrounds, but even race wise. We are different races that are part of the, the AAPI umbrella. And it was a political ideology that emerged in the 1960s when people who were of Japanese origin were being treated in a certain way after their history of being in internment camps, and then people who were Chinese Americans were treated in a certain way, and they decided to band together to create collective power. I think one has to understand, most importantly, how valid that category is even right now, because we don't know if it's of much use. In fact, this is a criticism that comes from South Asians all the time. In the AAPI umbrella, South Asians barely exist. If we do have South Asians, there'll be one token South Asian person. So when the focus is not even on South Asians, so then how are we going to hear the voices of Dalit people? And before I let you go, I'm just going to give you one more idea. The reason we don't hear about caste is because South Asian people, Indian Americans, don't want you to hear about it, because the opposition to the bill that was to become law in California in October 2023 was the opposition to that bill. That would mean that caste was just be included as a protected category against discrimination. Opposition to that bill came from Indian Americans. It came from Indian American Democrats. It came from Indian American donors to the Democratic Party. It came from people who were in power who said, we will not allow this law to go through. So if the
Mm.
community does not want you to hear about castes, how are you going to be able to do that? Because there are very few of us. And the establishment is not conducive to hearing Dalit voices. And that's, I think, the main reason that caste is still a taboo subject. We have our seasons. I mean, don't get me wrong. When
Mm.
some news item happens, people want to talk about caste. But when, like right now, caste is such a major issue for everything that I said earlier, we don't hear that in the election season at all because it's
We
not
don't.
considered. It's a seasonal subject.
Yashica, I cannot thank you enough for your bravery, your courage, your transparency, your willingness to share your knowledge with us, because otherwise we wouldn't know about these issues, and we wouldn't know about all the community facets that we should be employed in to help our fellow man, our fellow citizen, our fellow community member. So I hope that you will continue doing the great work that you do. We want to share, we're going to share links to those that are still with us. Please fulfill the survey that we have. We put a link for our survey. Just make sure that you fill that out so that we can continue to bring great guests like Yashica back to the Learning Cafe. And for our follow-up messaging, we want to make sure we include a link to the book, a link to as much resource and information from you, Yashica, so we can continue to support and we can amplify the awareness of these things that go on, because the more the merrier, the better, and injustice anywhere and injustice everywhere. So thank you
Absolutely.
once again, Yashica.
Thank you so much for having me. As always, such a pleasure and a treat.
Enjoy your evening, everyone. Bye-bye.